Feng Shui. By Ernest J. Eitel. Introductory. What is Feng Shui? This is a question which has been asked over and over again for the last 30 years. Ever since foreigners were allowed to settle down on the confines of this strange empire of China, this same question has been cropping up continually here and there. When purchasing a site, when building a house, when pulling down a wall, or raising a flagstaff, residents in the treaty ports have encountered innumerable difficulties, and all on account of Feng Shui. When it was proposed to erect a few telegraph poles, when the construction of a railway was urged upon the Chinese government, when a mere tramway was suggested to utilize the coal mines of the interior, Chinese officials would invariably make a polite bow and declare the thing impossible on account of Feng Shui. When, 30 years ago, the leading merchants of the colony of Hong Kong endeavored to place the business part of the town in the so-called Happy Valley, and to make that part of the island the center of the whole town, they ignominiously failed on account of Feng Shui. When the Hong Kong government cut a road, now known as the Gap, to the Happy Valley, the Chinese community was thrown into a state of abject terror and fright, on account of the disturbance which this amputation of the dragon's limbs would cause to the Feng Shui of Hong Kong. And when many of the engineers, employed at the cutting, died of Hong Kong fever, and the foreign houses already built in the Happy Valley had to be deserted on account of malaria, the Chinese triumphantly declared it was an act of retributory justice on the part of Feng Shui. When Senior Amiral, the governor of Macau, who combined with a great passion for constructing roads and unlimited contempt for Feng Shui, interfered with the situation and aspects of Chinese tombs, he was waylaid by Chinese, his head cut off. And the Chinese called this dastardly deed the revenge of Feng Shui. Surely there must be something in Feng Shui, if it drives the lowest classes of Chinese to commit a foul murder, and is eagerly availed of by ministers of state, as a satisfactory excuse for their own unwillingness to further the progress of trade and civilization. What is Feng Shui? Sinologues looked through the Chinese classics for an answer to this question, searched through their dictionaries, and found none. Merchants asked their compradors and houseboys, what is Feng Shui? But the replies they got were rather obscure and confused, and at best they were told that Feng Shui means wind and water, and is so called because it's a thing like wind, which you cannot comprehend, and like water, which you cannot grasp. But, strange to say, Chinese constantly assert that foreigners know all about Feng Shui. When mortality was frightful among the Hong Kong troops quartered in Murray Barracks, and the colonial surgeon proposed the planting of bamboos at the back of the buildings, the Chinese justly remarked that this measure was in strict accordance with Feng Shui. And when it was found that disease was actually checked thereby, they looked upon it as a proof of the virtues of Feng Shui. When foreign residents of Hong Kong began to build villas in Pak Fu Lam, which Feng Shui declares to be the best site of the island, when the government began to build a reservoir there, when tanks were built on the north side of Hong Kong, and the hillside studded with trees, when the cutting of earth was forbidden in places where there is much decomposed rock, the Chinese in all of these cases supposed foreigners to know more about Feng Shui than they would tell. And the Surveyor General was put down as a profound adept in Feng Shui. Why, they say, there is Government House, occupying the very best spot on the northern side of the island, screened at the back by high trees and gently shelving terraces, skirted right and left by roads with graceful curves. And the whole situation combining everything that Feng Shui would prescribe. How is it possible that foreigners pretend to know nothing of Feng Shui? Well, if Feng Shui were no more than what our common sense and natural instincts teach us, Chinese Feng Shui would be no such puzzle to us. But the fact is, the Chinese have made Feng Shui a black art, and those that are proficient in this art and derive their livelihood from it, find it to their advantage to make the same mystery of it, with which European alchemists and astrologers used to surround their vagaries. Every resident of China, however, acquires by a few years practical intercourse with the Chinese a tolerably clear idea of what Feng Shui is, and most of my readers no doubt know, that practically speaking it is simply a system of superstition, supposed to teach people where and when to build a tomb or to erect a house so as to ensure for those concerned everlasting prosperity and happiness. Since my arrival in China I have had a great many practical collisions with Feng Shui, and having for many years collected notes on the subject and studied its literature in all its branches, I now propose to lay the result of my studies before the public. Feng Shui is, however, as I take it, but another name for natural science, and I must ask therefore the indulgence of my readers, for my introducing a general outline of Chinese physical science in order to make the system of Feng Shui intelligible. Natural science has never been cultivated in China in that technical, dry, and matter-of-fact fashion, which seems to us inseparable from true science. Chinese naturalists did not take much pains in studying nature and ferreting out her hidden secrets by minute and practical tests and experiments. They invented no instruments to aid them in the observation of the heavenly bodies, they never took to hunting beetles and stuffing birds, they shrank from the idea of dissecting animal bodies, nor did they chemically analyze inorganic substances. But with very little actual knowledge of nature they evolved a whole system of natural science from their own inner consciousness and expounded it according to the dogmatic formulae of ancient tradition. Deplorable, however, as this absence of practical and experimental investigation is, which opened the door to all sorts of conjectural theories, it preserved in Chinese natural science a spirit of sacred reverence for the divine powers of nature. Though modern Confucianism has long ago discarded the belief in one supreme personal God, of which their classical writings still preserve a dead record, and though they substituted, for the personal God whom their forefathers worshipped, an abstract entity, devoid of personality, devoid of all attributes whatsoever, yet they look upon nature not as a dead inanimate fabric, but as a living breathing organism. They see a golden chain of spiritual life running through every form of existence and binding together, as in one living body, everything that subsists in heaven above or on earth below. What has so often been admired in the natural philosophy of the Greeks, that they made nature live, that they saw in every stone, in every tree, a living spirit, that they peopled the sea with naiads, the forest with satyrs, this poetical, emotional and reverential way of looking at natural objects, is equally so a characteristic of natural science in China. The whole system of Feng Shui is based on this emotional conception of nature. We may smile at the unscientific, rudimentary character of Chinese physiology. We may point out, that every branch of science in China is but a rudimentary groping after truths with which every schoolboy in Europe is familiar. We may conclude, that China as a whole resembles but an overgrown child, on whose intellect has fallen a sudden blight and who grew up since to manhood, to old age, with no more knowledge than that of a precocious baby. And yet I say, looking at this same China, the oldest among ancient peoples, the greatest among great empires, or at least the most populous among all the countries of the world, hoary with old age, heavy, dull, childishly ignorant as regards matters of intellect, yet I say, would God, that our own men of science had preserved in their observatories, laboratories and lecture rooms that same childlike reverence for the living powers of nature. That sacred awe and trembling fear of the mysteries of the unseen, that firm belief in the reality of the invisible world and its constant intercommunication with the seen and the temporal, which characterize these Chinese gropings after natural science. The system of Feng Shui is of comparatively modern origin. Its diagrams and leading ideas are indeed borrowed from one of the ancient classics, but its method and practical application are almost wholly based on the teachings of Chu He and others, who lived under the Sung dynasty, A.D. 1126 to 1278, and whose commentaries to the classics are read in every school. Chu He's mode of thinking has in fact been adopted by modern Confucianism, and forms the philosophical basis of the whole system of Feng Shui. According to Chu He, there was in the beginning one abstract principle or monad, called the absolute nothing, which evolved out of itself the great absolute. This abstract principle or monad, the great absolute, is the primordial cause of all existence. When it first moved, its breath or vital energy congealing, produced the great male principle. When it had moved to the uttermost it rested, and in resting produced the female principle. After it had rested to the utmost extent, it again moved, and thus went on in alternate motion and rest without cessation. When this supreme cause thus divided itself into male and female, that which was above constituted heaven, and that which was beneath formed the earth. Thus it was that heaven and earth were made. But the supreme cause having produced by evolution the male and female principles, and through them heaven and earth, ceased not its constant permutations, in the course of which men and animals, vegetables and minerals, rose into being. The same vital energy, moreover, continued to act ever since, and continued to act through those two originating causes, the male and female powers of nature, which ever since mutually and alternately push and agitate one another, without a moment's intermission. Now, the energy animating the two principles is called in Chinese Hai, or the breath of nature. When this breath first went forth and produced the male and female principles and finally the whole universe, it did not do so arbitrarily or at random, but followed fixed, inscrutable and immutable laws. These laws or order of nature, called Li, were therefore abstractly considered prior to the issuing of the vital breath, and must therefore be considered separately. Again, considering this Li, or the general order of the universe, the ancient sages observed that all the laws of nature and all the workings of its vital breath are in strict accordance with certain mathematical principles, which may be traced and illustrated by diagrams, exhibiting the numerical proportion of the universe called So, or numbers. But the breath of nature or the Hai, the order of nature called Li, and the mathematical proportions of nature, called So, these three principles are not directly cognizable to the senses, they are hidden from view, and only become manifest through forms and outlines of physical nature. In other words, the phenomena of nature, her outward forms of appearance, constitute a fourth branch of the system of natural science called Ing, or forms of nature. Now these four divisions, Li, or the general order of nature, So, her numerical proportions, Hai, her vital breath or subtle energies, and Ing, her forms of appearance, constitute what is popularly called the system of Feng Shui. No Chinese work on Feng Shui, however, or at least none that I have seen or heard of, follows out this division methodically, though they all mention these four principles and give them here and there due prominence. On the other hand, this division of four branches of the Feng Shui system is not my own. A distinguished Cantonese scholar, a member of the Imperial College, mentions, in a preface which he wrote to a popular geomantic work, that the whole system of Feng Shui might advantageously be divided into the above-mentioned four parts. From this preface I have taken the hint, and propose now to set before my readers the system of Feng Shui, following out this fourfold plan, and working it out so that it should give them an insight into the whole system of Chinese natural science generally. How do you find this book? Any thoughts about the book or the author? Any suggestion for improvement? Please take a moment to share your thoughts in a comment. If you like it, share it with your friends who might enjoy it as well. Subscribe to keep in touch. Visit CompleteAudiobooks.com for more quality content. 2. The Laws of Nature. In accordance with the foregoing remarks, I have to deal first with Li, or the general principles ruling nature, with the laws of the physical universe. To understand these aright, we must at the outset keep in mind, that the Chinese look upon heaven as the ideal type, of which our earth is but the coarse material reflex. Everything that exists on earth is but the transient form of appearance of some celestial agency. Everything terrestrial has its prototype, its primordial cause, its ruling agency in heaven. The Chinese philosopher, looking at the beauties of nature, the variety of hills and plains, rivers and oceans, the wonderful harmony of color, light and shade, sees in it but the dim reflex of that more splendid scenery frescoed in ethereal beauty on heaven's starry firmament. He gazes at the sun, that dazzling regent of the day, and recognizes in him, as his terrestrial reflex, the male principle of creation, ruling everything that is under the sun. He lifts up his eye to the moon, the beautiful queen of the night, and sees her reflex on earth, in the female principle, pervading all sublunary forms of existence. He observes the swift rotatory course of the 5 planets, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, Mercury and Saturn, and sees their counterpart on earth in the ceaseless interchange and permutations of the 5 elements of nature, wood, fire, metal, water and earth. He contemplates the spangled firmament at night, and compares with it its dimly reflected transcript on the surface of our earth, where the mountain peaks form the stars, the rivers and oceans answer to the Milky Way. In short, the firmament of heaven is to a Chinese beholder the mysterious textbook, in which the laws of nature, the destinies of nations, the fate and fortunes of every individual are written in hieroglyphic mystic characters, intelligible to none but to the initiated. Now, to decipher these tables of heaven, to break the seals of this apocalyptic book, is the prime object of Feng Shui. And the first method to be employed in the deciphering of this heavenly horoscope of the future, the first key that is to be inserted to unlock that puzzling safe, in which the fortunes of present and future generations are locked up, is the knowledge of the general principles or laws of nature. Learn then, if you will learn your fortunes, and treasure well these lessons: 1. That heaven rules the earth. 2. That both heaven and earth influence all living beings and that it is in your hands to turn this influence to the best account for your advantage. 3. That the fortunes of the living depend also upon the goodwill and general influence of the dead. As to the first point, the influence which heaven exercises upon the earth, the agencies that come under consideration here are the sun and the moon, with the 12 signs of the zodiac and the 28 constellations. The 5 planets, for only 5 are known to the Chinese, the 7 stars of the Great Bear and 9 other stars of the Northern Bushel. The sun, as we have remarked before, influences the whole physical universe, and the sun's apparent course, as marked by the 12 zodiacal signs, is therefore an important element in the calculation of heaven's influence upon earth. The Chinese divide the ecliptic into 12 equal parts, to each of which they give the name of some animal. Thus the first they call the rat, it corresponds to Aries; the next is called the ox, and it is our identical Taurus. The third, which they call the tiger, corresponds to Gemini; the fourth, or the hare, corresponds to Cancer; the fifth, the dragon, answers to Leo; the sixth, or the snake, to Virgo; the seventh, called the horse, to Libra; the eighth, the ram, to Scorpio; the ninth, the monkey, to Sagittarius; the 10th, the cock, to Capricorn; the 11th, the dog, to Aquarius; and the 12th, the boar, to Pisces. Owing to the precession of the equinoxes or the shifting of the equinoctial points from east to west, a change has occurred since the ancestors of the Chinese fixed upon these 12 asterisms. I say a change has occurred in the relations between the signs of the zodiac and their respective asterisms. 2,000 years ago the zodiacal signs and asterisms corresponded, so that when the sun entered the first point of the sign Aries, he entered also the constellation of the same name. The effect of the precession of the equinoxes has been to separate the asterisms from their denominational signs, so that the constellation Pisces is now in the sign Aries and the sign Aries in the sign Taurus. The Chinese, not knowing of the precession of the equinoxes, are rather perplexed by the discrepancy, but caring less for accuracy and more for ancient tradition, ignore the actual discrepancy, and still represent the 12 signs. Not as they appear now, but as they appeared to their ancestors 2,000 years ago. They use the 12 zodiacal signs especially to determine the 24 seasons of the year. When the sun enters the 15th degree of Aquarius, February 5th, spring begins. When he enters Pisces, February 19th, the rainy season sets in. When he reaches the 15th degree of Pisces, March 5th, insects get excited. When he enters Aries, March 30th, the vernal equinox comes round, followed, April 5th, by the term called bright and clear. Entering Taurus, April 20th, he brings fructifying rain and, May 5th, the beginning of summer. In Gemini, May 21st, he brings the 2 terms called the grain is filling, and June 6th, the grain is in the ear. In Cancer he brings the 2 terms summer solstice, June 21st, and little heat, July 7th, when the sun is in Leo, June 23rd, the great heat begins and, August 7th, autumn sets in. When the sun is in Virgo, August 23rd, heat is limited and, September 8th, white dew will fall. When the sun is in Libra, September 23rd, the autumnal equinox takes place and, October 8th, cold dew descends. When in Scorpio, October 23rd, frost falls and, November 7th, winter sets in. When in Sagittarius, November 22nd, little snow will fall, and, December 7th, great snow. When the sun is in Capricorn, December 22nd, the winter solstice takes place and, January 6th, little cold sets in. When the sun enters Aquarius, January 20th, great cold sets in, and thus the circle of the year is completed. Next in importance to the 12 zodiacal signs come the 28 constellations, or abodes, through which the moon travels in her monthly course along the ecliptic. These 28 constellations are divided into 4 sections, one of which is called the Azure Dragon, located in the east, and comprising the first 7 constellations. The next 7 constellations are called the Sable Warrior, whose abode is in the north, the third 7 bear the name of the White Tiger, situated in the west, and the last 7 are designated the Vermilion Bird, ruling the south. But besides these 4 constellations which are looked upon as spirits influencing the earth, it is further to be observed that of these 28 constellations numbers 4, 11, 18 and 25 form a lucky conjunction with the Sun, Nos. 5, 12, 19 and 26 with the Moon, whilst of the 5 planets the following conjunctions are luck-bringing: Jupiter with numbers 1, 8, 15, 22, Venus with numbers 2, 9, 16, 23, Saturn with numbers 3, 10, 17 and 24, Mars with Nos. 6, 13, 21 and 27, and Mercury with numbers 7, 14, 20 and 28. Besides the 28 constellations, the 5 planets known to the Chinese and the occult virtues ascribed to them play a very important part in the system of Feng Shui. Jupiter is said to reign in the east, ruling the spring and has the attribute of benevolence. Mars dwells in the south, commands the summer and favors propriety. Venus dwells in the west, rules in the autumn and her province is decorum. Mercury is located in the north, rules in winter and is the representative of wisdom. Saturn reigns in the middle of the earth, rules midsummer and is characterized by fidelity. There are other heavenly bodies which likewise exercise an influence upon the earth. As the 5 planets form, in addition to the sun and moon, the 7 rulers of the seasons, thus also the 7 stars of the Great Bear contribute their quota to the direction of the seasons. This splendid constellation has attracted the attention and poetical fancy of almost every nation on earth, but I never heard of any people that turned this remarkable cluster of stars to such a practical account. The Chinese look upon the 7 stars of the Great Bear as forming a natural clock. For the body of the Great Bear being in ancient times considerably nearer to the North Pole than it is now, the tail appeared to move round the pole somewhat like the hand of a clock or watch. Considering then the Earth's surface to form the dial plate and dividing the horizon into 24 equal parts, whilst the tail of the Great Bear acts as the hand of the clock, we have a simple method to determine the above-mentioned 24 seasons of the year. When the tail of the Great Bear points, at nightfall, to the east, it is spring to all the world. When it points to the south, it is summer, when it points to the west, it is autumn, and when it points, at nightfall, to the north, it is winter. The light of these 7 stars is supposed moreover to exercise a great influence upon the earth and upon all dwellers on earth, and these 7 stars are, therefore, combined with sun and moon, called the 9 luminaries of the world. There is another set of stars, called the 9 stars of the bushel, which are likewise of great importance for the determination of lucky or unlucky aspects of any given locality and its consequent influence upon the fate of men. These 9 stars are minutely described in every Chinese almanac or calendar, but it is difficult to determine their position on the sky. They are called the 9 stars of the northern bushel. But the latter term is sometimes applied to the North Pole, sometimes to the Great Bear, sometimes to one of the 28 constellations called the bushel. But their position in the heavens is of little importance. Some authorities even say they have no fixed place at all, but are moving about in the atmosphere, for they have each and all their counterparts or representatives on earth in the shape of mountains. And it is the business and art of the geomancer to determine which mountain peak or hill corresponds to the one or other of these 9 stars, each of which has its own permanent relation to one of the 5 elements or to one of the above-mentioned 8 diagrams. The next point to be considered is the influence which both heaven and earth exercise upon human beings. The principal agents through which heaven, and especially the 5 planets, act upon all living creatures are the 5 elements of nature. By these however we must not understand 5 material substances, chemically indissoluble, but rather spiritual essences, each characteristically different from the other and forming the generative causes of all material substances. These 5 elements are wood, fire, earth, metal and water, the first of them being the agent of Jupiter, the second that of Mars, the third that of Saturn, the fourth that of Venus, the fifth that of Mercury. But it is also important to observe the mutual relation of the 5 elements to each other, for they both produce and destroy each other if placed in certain conjunctions. Wood produces fire, fire produces earth, earth produces metal, metal produces water, water produces wood. On the other hand, metal destroys wood, wood destroys, i.e. absorbs, earth, earth destroys, i.e. absorbs, water, water destroys fire, fire destroys metal. Again it is to be considered that wood is abundant in the east, metal in the west, water in the north, fire in the south, whilst earth predominates in the center between the 4 cardinal points. It is also to be borne in mind, that wood reigns in spring, fire in summer, metal in autumn, water in winter, and earth during the last 18 days of each season. In this way the 5-fold influence of the planets pervades and rules all nature, as, for instance, the 5 constituents of the human frame, muscles, veins, flesh, bones, skin, and hair, the 5 inward parts or viscera, viz. heart, liver, stomach, lungs, and kidneys, the 5 colors, white, black, red, blue, and yellow, the 5 fortunes, riches, honor, longevity, children, and a peaceful death. The 5 social relations, prince and minister, father and son, husband and wife, older and younger brothers, and friends. In addition to the influence which according to the laws of nature heaven and earth exercise upon the destinies of living beings, there are to be considered the laws regulating the influence of the spirits of the dead upon the living. This is a doctrine which seems strange to us, but which has nothing unreasonable in itself to a Chinaman accustomed to worship the spirits of his ancestors, whom he supposes to be constantly hovering near. And to whom he therefore formally announces every event in his family, and offers sacrifices of meat and drink. My own animal spirits, says the commentator to the Analects of Confucius, are the animal spirits of my progenitors. When on my part one carry to the utmost my sincerity and respect in worshipping them, then the spirits of my ancestors are present with me. Just like a stalk of grain, when the original plant is dead, new roots appear on the side, thus connecting the identical real spirit down from past generations to the present time. Though we speak of heaven and earth, said Chu He, yet there is in reality but one breath, spirit, that upholds them. Though we speak of individuals, and distinguish one from the other, yet there is in reality but one breath that animates them all. My own breath, spirit, is the identical breath, spirit, of my ancestors. This idea of the organic unity, nay identity, of the spiritual basis of life in nature and life in individuals, was a favorite theme of discussion with Chu He and other philosophers of the Sung dynasty. According to this now universally influential school, the human soul is possessed of a dual nature, and leads, as it were, a double life. They distinguish an animus and an anima. The former is the energy of human nature as embodying the male principle of nature. The breath of the animus is the breath of heaven. The anima, on the other hand, is the redundancy or pleroma, so to speak, of the contracting, female, energy of nature. The breath of the anima is the breath of the earth. The animus is the spiritual, the anima the material or animal element of the soul. When, through the exhaustion of the vital breath, the body is broken up, the animus returns to heaven, the anima to earth. That is to say, each is dissolved again into those general elements of nature whence each derived its origin and the temporary embodiment of which each was within the sphere of individual life. The souls of deceased ancestors therefore are as omnipresent as the elements of nature, as heaven and earth themselves. Thus the Chinese have been taught to consider themselves as constantly surrounded by a spirit world, invisible indeed and inaccessible by touch or handling, but none the less real, none the less influential. Now, the common people have the notion, which is no doubt but a popularized application of the above-given philosophical propositions, that the souls of the ancestors are by their animal nature chained, as it were, for some time to the tomb in which their bodies are interred, whilst by their spiritual nature they feel impelled to hover near the dwellings of their descendants, whence it is but a natural and logical inference to suppose that the fortunes of the living depend in some measure upon the favorable situation of the tombs of their ancestors. If a tomb is so placed that the animal spirit of the deceased, supposed to dwell there, is comfortable and free of disturbing elements, so that the soul has unrestricted egress and ingress, the ancestors' spirits will feel well disposed towards their descendants, will be enabled to constantly surround them, and willing to shower upon them all the blessings within reach of the spirit world. So deeply engrafted is this idea of the influence of the dead upon the living, that Chinese wishing to get into the good graces of foreigners will actually go out to the Hong Kong cemeteries in the Happy Valley and worship there at the tombs of foreigners, supposing that the spirits of the dead there, pleased with their offerings and worship, would influence the spirits of the living, and thus produce a mutual good understanding between all the parties concerned. Naturally, therefore, every Chinaman takes the greatest pains to place the tombs of his relatives in such a situation, that no star or planet above, nor any terrestrial element below, no breath or subtle influence of nature, no ill-portending configuration of hills and dales, should disturb the quiet repose of the dead, for upon this depend the fortunes and misfortunes of the living. It is consequently important to know the rules by which the luckiest spot for a grave can be found, and as the place best adapted for a grave depends principally upon the happiest conjunction of all heavenly and terrestrial elements, it is clear that the method by which the most suitable site for a tomb is found, is also applicable for the selection of a good site for a dwelling house or any place of abode whatsoever. For the same influences which act upon the animal spirits of the dead have also their bearing upon the living. We have to do here, however, only with general principles, and I will state the rules applicable to this purpose as briefly as possible. In the first instance it must be understood, that there are in the earth's crust two different, shall I say magnetic, currents, the one male, the other female, the one positive, the other negative, the one favorable, the other unfavorable. The one is allegorically called the azure dragon, the other the white tiger. The azure dragon must always be to the left, the white tiger to the right of any place supposed to contain a luck-bringing site. This therefore is the first business of the geomancer on looking out for a propitious site, to find a true dragon, and its complement the white tiger, both being discernible by certain elevations of the ground. Dragon and tiger are constantly compared with the lower and upper portion of a man's arm. In the bend of the arm the favorable site must be looked for. In other words, in the angle formed by dragon and tiger, in the very point where the two magnetic currents which they individually represent cross each other, there may the luck-bringing site, the place for a tomb or dwelling, be found. I say it may be found there, because, besides the conjunction of dragon and tiger, there must be there also a tranquil harmony of all the heavenly and terrestrial elements which influence that particular spot, and which is to be determined by observing the compass and its indication of the numerical proportions, and by examining the direction of the watercourses. In illustration of this I may remark that the favorable situation of Canton City consists in this, that it is placed in the very angle formed by two chains of hills running in gentle curves towards the Bogue, where they almost meet each other, forming a complete horseshoe. The chain of hills known as the White Clouds represent the dragon, whilst the undulating ground on the other side of the river forms the white tiger. The most favorable site of Canton is therefore the ground near the north gates, whence tiger and dragon run out to the right and left. For the luckiest spot, say the Feng Shui books, is like a modest virgin, loving retirement, and it is therefore one of the first rules to look, in a doubtful case, for a happy site in a recess. Another rule is, that on perfectly monotonous ground, on a perfectly level plain, or on monotonously steep declivities, where there is no indication of dragon and tiger, no good site can possibly be found. A third rule is to observe the distinction of male and female ground. Boldly rising elevations are called male, whilst uneven, softly undulating ground is called female ground. On ground where the male characteristics prevail, the lucky site is on a spot having female characteristics, either visible to the eye or indicated by the compass, whilst on a locality which is to be classed on the whole among female ground. The spot for a grave or house should have indications of the male principle ruling there. But the most favorable prognostics belong to a spot where there is a transition from male to female or from female to male ground, and where the surroundings combine as indicated by the compass both male and female characteristics in the proper proportion, which the Feng Shui books state to be 3/5 male to 2/5 female ground. Where however the female indications exceed the male, there are malign influences, counteracting all other favorable configurations. Finally, the place to be chosen for a grave or a tomb will, if all the above rules are attended to, be invariably dry, and free from white ants, which latter are the great dread of the living and the dead. These are but general principles, the application of which we shall presently observe in detail, when we have to treat of the compass as indicating the numerical proportions of the breath and of the forms of nature. 3. The numerical proportions of nature. I now proceed to consider the second division of the system of Feng Shui, called Su, or the numerical proportions of nature. Observing the heavens, the constant change of day and night, the numbers and distribution of the heavenly bodies, moving on, hosts of them, each in swift course, and yet never interfering with each other. I say observing this varied and yet harmonious whole, it struck the Chinese observer, that there are, at the basis of this grand scheme of heaven, mathematical principles. That all the heavenly bodies exist and move in certain numerical proportions. Again, observing our earth, with its constant revolutions of summer and winter, spring and autumn, growth and decay, life and death, the Chinese noticed, that here again the same mathematical order is repeated. That earth is but the reflex of heaven, the coarse material embodiment of the ideal mathematical problems, ethereally sketched on the firmament of heaven. Now, to illustrate and fathom this scheme of numerical proportions, which connects and holds together heaven and earth, the ancient sages of China invented certain diagrams. I do not attribute any credence to the story of Fu He observing a dragon horse coming out of the river, bearing on its back the geometrical delineations of the great scheme of heaven and earth, in diagrams and circles formed by the curling of the hairs. But the fact seems incontestable, that in the remotest times of Chinese antiquity certain diagrams were used to illustrate the numerical proportions of the universe. No matter who it was that first invented the scheme of diagrams, no matter whether he eliminated it from his own brain or by cogitating over the confused lines on the back of a tortoise, the fact remains that, more than 2,000 years ago, the Chinese had and used a scheme of diagrams essentially the same as that which is to the present day used by the ignorant and superstitious as a charm of ineffable efficacy, and frequently suspended over house doors. However, this set of 8 diagrams may have originally been constructed, whether synthetically or analytically, the way in which its origin was afterwards explained is this. Representing the superior creative male principle by one line, and the corresponding female principle by a line broken in 2, then multiplying and combining them, for diagrams are obtained, viz. 1. 2 parallel lines, representing the great male principle. 2. 2 parallel lines, each broken in 2, representing the great female principle. 3. A line broken in 2, with one parallel line below, called the little male. 4. One unbroken line, with a parallel line, broken in 2, below, called the little female. The great male diagram was then taken as a symbol for the sun, the heat, the intellect, the eyes, etc. The great female diagram was considered to represent the planets, the night, the body, the mouth, etc., whilst the little male diagram signified the moon, the cold, the passions, the ears, etc. And the little female diagram stood for the stars, the daylight, the form, the nose, etc. Proceeding then to combine these 4 diagrams with each other, in all possible forms, another set of 8 diagrams was obtained. It is geometrically composed of the preceding 4 diagrams, but its primitive explanation was, I presume, based on a now antiquated view of the elements composing nature. I have already noticed more than once the enumeration of 5 elements, metal, wood, water, fire, and earth, now current in China. In the time when this set of 8 diagrams was invented, quite a different enumeration of elements appears to have been in vogue. The Chinese must have then counted 6 elements, and named them as follows: thunder, wind, fire, ocean, water, and mountains. At any rate, one of the oldest classics of the Chinese, the Yih-king, explains this set of diagrams as follows: 1. 3 whole lines, representing the great male principle, stand for heaven and designate the south. 2. 3 broken parallel lines representing the great female principle, stand for earth and point to the north. Next follow what I take to signify the 6 elements of nature. 1. In the east, 2 whole lines with a broken line between, signify fire, for, says the Yih-king, in drying up the myriad of things there is nothing more parching than fire. 2. In the west, 2 broken lines with a whole line between, represent water, for in moistening the myriad of things there is nothing more humid than water. 3. In the southwest, 2 whole lines with 1 broken line on the inner side represent the wind, for in twirling round the myriad of things there is nothing more effective than wind. 4. In the northeast, 2 broken lines with 1 whole line on the inner side, correspond to thunder, for in agitating the myriad of things there is nothing more rapid than thunder. 5. In the southeast, 2 whole lines with 1 broken line on the outer side, represent vapor or the ocean, for in satisfying the myriad of things there is nothing more gratifying than the ocean. 6. In the northwest, 2 broken lines with 1 whole line on the outer side, signify mountains, for in bringing to a conclusion and again commencing the myriad of things, there is nothing more perfect than the mountains. Thus, the Yih-king adds, water and fire overtaking and blending with each other, thunder and wind not opposing one another, and the mountains and oceans being pervaded by the same breath. Nature can perform her transformations and complete and perfect the myriad of things. To allow fancy and imaginative ingenuity still wider play, these 8 diagrams are not only, as we have shown, made to correspond to the 8 points of the compass, but also to 8 different seasons. Even a set of 8 different animals are made to answer to these 8 diagrams, the first of which is said to represent the strength of a horse, the second the docility of an ox, the third is said to be pleasant like a pheasant, the fourth degrading like a swine, the fifth penetrating like a fowl, the 6th influential like a dragon, the 7th pleasing like a lamb, the 8th faithful like a dog. To illustrate all the innumerable changes and permutations of nature, these 8 diagrams were again multiplied with each other, and put through all possible combinations, and thus another set of 64 diagrams was obtained. Each having likewise a special name, special meaning and special occult virtues attached. This development of the original system ascribed to Fu He is however based on a different arrangement of the 8 principal diagrams. The diagram for heaven which Fu He's system placed in the south is now consigned to the northwest, whilst the fire diagram, which the more ancient system placed in the east, now occupies the south. In like manner the earth diagram, formerly ruling the north, is now relegated to the southwest and its place assigned to the water diagram which formerly reigned in the west. Accordingly we have, in this new arrangement of the 8 diagrams of Fu He, the diagram for water in the north, that for thunder in the east, that for fire in the south, and that for ocean in the west. The northeast is occupied by the diagram answering for mountains, the southeast by the wind diagram, whilst the diagram for earth is placed in the southwest, and that for heaven in the northwest. This new arrangement of the original 8 diagrams, and most especially its development into a set of 64 separate diagrams, is said to have been originated by Wen Wang, the reputed founder of the Zhou dynasty, who, whilst undergoing a term of solitary confinement, amused himself by arranging and rearranging stems of straw on the basis of those 8 diagrams, so that the various combinations of long and short stems of straw should represent the whole scheme of heaven and earth as pervaded by the male and female principles. We can readily believe that the Chinese, casting about for the inventor of this fanciful theory, hit upon the idea, that none but a man shut out from the world, none but a man whose brain is diseased by solitary confinement, could work out a system so ingenious indeed and marvelously fanciful, but so utterly devoid of all practical observation of nature. This absence of direct connection with and practical application of the facts ascertained by observation of nature was of course more and more felt. The more the Chinese progressed in their knowledge of astronomy and in the other branches of natural science. That ancient system of diagrams, based on an antiquated theory of 6 terrestrial elements, makes no allowance for the influence of the 5 planets, which were in after ages supposed to exercise an almost paramount influence upon the destinies of the human race. The 5 planets seem to have been unknown even in the days of Confucius, at any rate they are never mentioned in the Chinese classics. Consequently the philosophers of the Sung dynasty, finding the old system to clash with their popular views of astronomy, but having too much reverence for the sacred rust of antiquity to discard it altogether, retained the old diagrams, but worked them into a system, based on the idea, that the 5 planets, Venus, Jupiter, Mercury, Mars, and Saturn, and 5 corresponding terrestrial elements, metal, wood, water, fire and earth, contain as it were the principal solution of the great mystery of life. They ascribed to the 5 planets a central position, and searching out on this basis the numerical proportions of the universe, they arrived at the conclusion that all heavenly bodies and all the powers and influences of heaven are arranged according to the decimal system. Applying, then, the ancient 6 elements which enter into the plan of the 4 and 8 diagrams, and which indeed refer exclusively to earth and not to heaven, applying, I say, these ancient sets of 4 diagrams and of 8 diagrams to terrestrial relations alone, they came to the conclusion that all the formations of earth, all terrestrial relations, are based on the duodecimal system. Thus they invented a set of 10 symbolic characters or numbers intended to explain the mysteries of heaven, and called them the 10 heavenly stems. Then they drew up another series of 12 symbolic characters or numbers and used them as the mathematical key to solve all the problems relating to the earth, calling them the 12 terrestrial branches. They, moreover, distinguished in both the 10 heavenly stems and the 12 terrestrial branches, the even and uneven numbers. All the uneven numbers they declared, in obedience to the rules laid down in the Yih-king, to refer to the male principle, all the even numbers to the female principle in nature. Again, they divided, likewise adopting a rule of the ancient system, the 10 heavenly stems into 5 couples, but made each couple correspond not only to one of the 5 elements, but also to one of the 5 planets. The 12 terrestrial branches were made to signify the above-mentioned 12 signs of the zodiac, also the 12 points of the Chinese compass and the 12 divisions of the day, each division comprising 2 hours. Again, by combining the 2 series and joining the first of the 12 terrestrial branches to the first of the 10 heavenly stems, then joining the second characters of each series and going on through the 10 stems 6 times and through the 12 branches 5 times, they obtained a set of 60 cyclic characters, which they used to designate successive days and years, and which multiplied by 6 gave the 360 degrees of the ecliptic. Here we have then a series of logarithmic formulae, skillfully designed, to comprise all the numerical proportions which the Chinese ascribe to the universe and intricate enough to perplex any ordinary mind, and to awe by its mysteriousness the ignorant mass of the people. Skillful and ingenious manipulation of such a system naturally enables a man to impose upon the superstitious multitude, and consequently we find, that all the different arts of divination in China, astrology, geomancy, horoscopy, phrenology, chiromancy and so on, are all based upon this system of numbers. For geomantic purposes, with which alone we have to do here, all the above-mentioned diagrams and series of computations have been combined for practical and handy use in the shape of a compass, with a magnetic needle in the center. And all the different diagrams and cyclic characters with all the elements that enter into calculation inscribed in concentric circles on the board surrounding the needle. The use of the magnetic needle suggested to me the possibility that the Chinese might possibly have some empirical knowledge of terrestrial magnetism, and use the magnetic needle to observe the declination, inclination and intensity of the magnetic currents which run through the crust of the earth and which are nowadays being carefully watched by modern meteorologists in America and Europe. But I am sorry to say I have not been able to find even the slightest empirical knowledge of the fact, that a freely suspended magnet indicates by its movements the inclination, declination and intensity of the magnetic currents in the earth. To begin with the outmost of the circles inscribed on the compass plate, we find this circle, 18. Divided into 28 portions of unequal size, on each of which there is the name of one of the 28 constellations through which the moon passes in her course along the ecliptic, with the number of degrees each constellation occupies. This circle therefore represents the moon's orbit, and its use is to determine not only the lunar influences generally, but also the influence which each particular constellation is supposed to exercise on any given spot. Every Chinese calendar gives a series of 28 tables containing a minute enumeration of the geomantic affinities ascribed to each constellation, but it will suffice here to state that 15 of them are put down in the calendar as unlucky, 13 as lucky. To enable the geomancer, however, to determine the lucky or unlucky lunar influences of any locality with perfect accuracy, the next circle, 17, represents again the ecliptic, but divided into 360 degrees, of which some are marked as lucky, whilst on the next circle, 16. The successive odd numbers of 366 degrees are marked, in 28 portions corresponding to the 28 constellations of this 17 circle, thus enabling the geomancer to pronounce with regard to every inch of ground and with reference to every day in the year whether the female or male principle prevails here, for the odd numbers represent the male. The even numbers, left blank, the female principle. Proceeding farther towards the center, the next circle, 15, divided into 60 portions, is intended to illustrate the influence of the 5 planets in their relation to the 5 elements, metal, wood, water, fire, earth. These 5 terms are seriatim inscribed on the circle in different combinations, now destroying each other, then again indifferent to each other, then again producing each other, and so on. Each element occurs 12 times, but the element wood is in one place interpolated, where it is placed with the element fire to the right and left, occupying 2 degrees which correspond to the 10th and 11th degree of the constellation Bushel, 6 stars in the shoulder and bow of Sagittarius. The geomancer referring to any particular locality is thus enabled to say not only by which particular planets the spot is influenced, but also whether the terrestrial element prevailing there is in harmony with elements ruling the adjoining places to the right and left. Suppose, for instance, a certain spot is indicated by the compass as being under the influence of Mars. Well, the corresponding terrestrial element is fire. Now, if the compass there indicates wood to the left and water to the right, the omen is very bad, because water destroys fire and fire destroys wood. But suppose the compass indicated the element earth to the left of the element fire, and to its right the element wood, this would be a favorable conjunction, because wood produces fire and fire produces earth. The elements are however in places so arranged that they are seriatim indifferent to each other, neither producing or destroying each other, which of course is likewise considered a favorable conjunction. The next circle, 14, is formed by 2 concentric lines of characters divided into 60 portions. The inner line of characters gives 13 different combinations of the 10 heavenly stems, so arranged, that each character signifies at the same time a certain element and either an even, female, or uneven, male, number. Each of these 13 combinations of elements, or planets, begins with the element, or planet, wood, i.e. Jupiter, and alternately, now with the number 1, male, and then with the number 2, female. The 12th combination only, beginning with the element, planet, fire, i.e. Mars, and the number 3, male, makes an exception. Out of the 13 combinations 8 contain the complete series of elements, or planets, in the order in which they produce each other, wood, fire, earth, metal, water. The remaining 5 combinations contain 4 elements, or planets, each. 3 of these combinations give the elements in couples, in accordance with the order of production. 2 combinations only give the elements, or planets, in couples, the elements, or planets, of which produce each other in the one and destroy each other in the other couple. The corresponding outer line of characters, divided into 12 spaces, subjoins to every 5 characters of the inner line one of the 12 zodiacal signs 5 times repeated. Consequently, each of the 12 divisions of this circle contains on the outer line one zodiacal sign placed in conjunction with 5 different elements, or planets, on the inner line. But in every zodiacal sign the arrangement and mutual relation of the elements, or planets, is different. Proceeding farther towards the center, the next circle, 13, in 60 divisions gives 48 characters, referring each to a different symbol of those famous 64 diagrams of Wen Wang which I have mentioned above. But of these 48 different diagrams there are 6, which go to form the set of 8 diagrams, viz., earth, ocean, fire, thunder, wind, and mountains, and which are here given twice, in different locations. 6 others, not belonging to the set of 8 diagrams, are each given twice side by side. For the explanation of these 48 diagrams the geomancer resorts to the table given in every calendar, where each of these diagrams is given and the lucky and unlucky days, for geomantic work, pointed out. The next circle, 12, is divided into 24 divisions, each of which is subdivided into 5 compartments. The second and fourth compartments in each of the 24 divisions have a double row of characters inscribed all round. The inner line of characters gives alternately through each division, now the 2 symbols for fire, ping ting, which signify also the numbers 3, male, and 4, female. And then the 2 symbols for metal, kong sin, or the numbers 7, male, and 8, female, repeated twice in each division. The series being ping ting, kong sin. In the corresponding outer line the 12 terrestrial branches or signs of the zodiac are given below the above-mentioned symbols in 12 divisions, each division having one zodiacal sign 4 times repeated in identical characters. The use of this circle therefore is to connect in rotation each of the 12 signs of the zodiac with either of the 2 elements fire or metal, or with the planets Mars or Venus, as also with certain male or female numbers. The following circle, 11, is identical with another counting 8. From the center, only the characters inscribed on them are so arranged that, for instance, the symbol designating due north is on the one circle to the left, on the other to the right of the line which runs due north between them. Now, on both these circles, divided in 24 divisions, are inscribed seriatim one or other of the 12 branches, alternating with one or other of the 10 stems, but omitting the 2 stems which designate earth. Whilst after every 5 of these characters one of the following 4 diagrams, taken from the set of 8 diagrams, is inserted, the diagrams for heaven, earth, mountains, and wind. This circle therefore combines the 12 points of the Chinese compass, with simultaneous reference to the elements wood, fire, metal, and water, to the planets Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and Mercury, and to the 4 geomantic principles heaven, earth, mountains, and wind. The next circle, X, gives the minor divisions of the compass. It is divided into 60 spaces, on which however not only the bearings of the compass are inscribed, but also the bearings of the aforementioned 10 heavenly stems and 4 geomantic principles. It reads, for instance, from east to south as follows: due east. 7, metal, 3, fire. 3, fire, 7, metal. Due 2, wood. 5, earth, 5, earth. Due ESE, 314E, 7, metal, 3, fire. 3, fire, 7, metal. Due wind. 5, earth, 5, earth. Due SS. E, 3/4 E, 7, metal, 3, fire. 3, fire, 7, metal. Due fire. 5, earth, 5, earth. Due south. The numbers 7, 3, 5 mean of course fractions of 10, or subdivisions of the compass. The word 7, metal, 3, fire, for instance, mean that 7/10 of this subdivision of the compass are ruled by the element metal, and 3/10 of the same space by the element fire. With this circle corresponds the next, 9. Which gives likewise in 60 divisions 2 concentric rows of characters. This circle with its characters is identically the same with the above described 14. Circle and with another counting V from the center. Only the inscriptions on the 3 circles are in different positions, so that, for instance, the first character of the 14 circle, inner row, is nearly east, that of the V circle nearly E, whilst the first of the 9 circle is between them. The next, 8, circle is identically the same in all but position of characters with the XL, and supplements that circle by making the line in which the influence of each symbol runs more prominent. The following circle, 7, is divided like the 8 and 11 into 24 divisions, each division representing one of the 24 solar terms or 24 periods corresponding to the day on which the sun enters the 1st and 15th degree of one of the zodiacal signs. This circle is therefore a miniature calendar, and its use is to determine the season during which a house may be erected or a tomb built in any given place. These 24 seasons being however not only under the influence of the sun, but also under that of the 5 elements and the 5 planets. The next 2 circles exhibit the influence which these elements and planets exercise on each of the 24 seasons of the year. The first of them, 6, brings to bear upon each season one of the 12 zodiacal signs and 2 planets or elements, fire, Mars, and metal, Venus. The second, V, however, brings not only 2 but all the 5 elements and planets, in addition to the 12 signs of the zodiac, to bear upon the 24 seasons. This circle is divided into 12 distinct portions, with a blank space between each, and each division contains on the outer row of characters one zodiacal sign 5 times repeated. Whilst on the corresponding portion of the inner row 5 different celestial stems are inscribed. But these stems are arranged in 12 different combinations, giving alternately, now in even now in uneven numbers, the various elements or planets. The succeeding circle, 4, is divided into 24 equal parts, on which are inscribed, 1, the 12 zodiacal signs, the uneven numbers being marked red as peculiarly auspicious, viz. Aries, Gemini, who represent the white tiger, Leo, who represents the azure dragon, Libra, Sagittarius, and Aquarius, 2, 8 of the 10 celestial stems, viz. 2 characters for the element water, 2 for wood, 2 for fire, and 2 for metal. 3, 4 symbols belonging to the 8 diagrams, viz. Heaven, marked red, earth, marked red, wind, and water. This circle is essentially the same as 8 and 11. And their identity is made still more prominent by the equality of breadth of space and size of characters. The only difference in these 3 circles is that the characters are placed in different position, indicating more prominently the exact line in which the influence of each symbol proceeds. The next circle, 3, joins to the 12 zodiacal signs those 9 stars of the northern bushel which we mentioned above. They are arranged here in 24 compartments, 1, called the breaker of the phalanx, occurring 3 times. 3 others, called the military star, the literary star, and the star of purity, each 4 times, 3 others, called the avaricious wolf, official emoluments, and the wide door, occur each twice. And the remaining 2, the left-hand assistant, and the right-hand assistant, each once. The following circle, 2, gives, in 24 divisions, of which however every alternate one is left blank, 1, the diagrams for heaven, earth, mountains, and wind, 2, 8 heavenly stems in couples, of which each character refers to a different number. Element or planet. The sequence is as follows, 1, wind, 2, number 2 wood and number 3 fire, 3, wind, 4, earth, 5, number 4 fire and number 7 metal, 6, earth, 7, heaven, 8, number 8 metal and number 9 water, 9, heaven, 10, mountains. 11, number 10 water and number 1 wood, 12, mountains. It will be noticed that the 4 couples of elements, planets, here mentioned are so arranged, that each couple contains an even, female, and uneven, male, number. And that the elements, planets, they refer to are in accordance with the order of production. The first and inmost circle gives in 8 compartments the names of 8 zodiacal signs: Leo, Gemini, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Pisces, Cancer, Virgo, and Libra. Now, of course, when the compass is consulted with reference to any given spot, it is not only one of these 18 circles, but every one of them. That is made to contribute some quota towards the determination of the lucky or unlucky aspects of the place in question. The result, therefore, is that for every single spot quite a number of bewildering conjunctions can be enumerated, which produce with the uninitiated the belief that this compass is a most mysterious compound of supernatural wisdom. And I think we must acknowledge that it is indeed a clever contrivance, making the most of a very rudimentary knowledge of astronomy, for it comprises in one perspicuous arrangement all the different principles of Chinese physical science. The male and female principles, the 8 diagrams, the 64 diagrams, the solar orbit, the lunar ecliptic, the 360 degrees of longitude, the days of the year, the 5 planets, the 5 elements, the 28 constellations, the 12 zodiacal signs, the 9 stars of the bushel, the 24 seasons, and the 12 points of the compass. The common people know all these terms by name, but not understanding their meaning, they regard the terms themselves with a certain reverential awe, supposing them to exercise some mysterious magic influence. Now, the geomancer, taking advantage of this popular prejudice, comes to them with this compass in his hands, of which the ordinary Chinaman understands next to nothing. And pronouncing his judgment with reference to any given spot in a mystifying learned jargon, his apocalyptic utterances are received with superstitious dread even where there is not much faith in the system. The geomancer himself knows very well that his predictions are all guesswork, based on what experience he manages to collect in the course of his practice. But he also knows that his prophecies are sometimes realized in consequence of the very fear they inspire, and though his predictions may more frequently be disproved by actual events, yet he comforts himself by thinking that this compass after all makes money flow if not into the lap of his employers yet certainly into his own pocket. 4. The breath of nature. We now come to the third division of the system of Feng Shui, the doctrine of nature's breath. Nature, as I have had occasion to remark before, is looked upon by the Chinese observer as a living breathing organism, and we cannot be surprised, therefore, to find the Chinese gravely discussing the inhaling and exhaling breath of nature. One in fact, with the distinction of these two breaths, the expanding breath, as they call it, and reverting breath, they explain almost every phenomenon in nature. Between heaven and earth there is nothing so important, so almighty and omnipresent as this breath of nature. It enters into every stem and fiber, and through it heaven and earth and every creature live and move and have their being. Nature's breath is, in fact, but the spiritual energy of the male and female principles. Thus at the commencement the congelation of the transforming breath of nature is the change from nothing into being of the male principle. The exhaustion of the transforming breath of nature is the change from existence to non-existence of the female principle of nature. When therefore in the beginning these two principles first issued from the Great Absolute, it was then that nature's breath first went forth. But at first nature's breathing was confused and chaotic, so that for some time heaven and earth were not divided, but when nature's breath reverted, and exhalation and inhalation regularly succeeded each other, heaven and earth, the male and female principles, were divided and everything in nature was produced in its proper order. Even now, whenever the breath of nature first advances or expands, something like an unshapen fetus is created, which constitutes the germ-like beginning of future developments. This shapeless incipient origin of things being light and pure, but not yet possessing any determinate form, belongs to the male, and may be called the superior principle of nature. But when the determinate shape has been assumed, it manifestly presents itself to view, and constitutes the exact form of things, possessing body, color, shape and manner. This, being heavy, gross and cognizable to human senses, belongs to the female, and may be called the inferior principle, or in other words, one advancing and one reverting breath, regularly succeeding each other, are the condition of the constant succession of growth and decay, of life and death in the physical world. The two breaths of nature are, however, essentially but one breath. The male and female principles, uniting, constitute the beginning of things. When they disperse they cause decay, dissolution and death. Sometimes they disperse and again unite. Thus, after their termination they again commence, which constitutes the principle of reproduction, going on throughout nature without intermission. As to the breath that pervades human beings, the energies of nature must here also sometimes get exhausted, and death is that which no man can avoid. At death, the grosser parts of man's animal soul descend and return to earth, but the finer parts of his spiritual nature diffuse and expand throughout the world and become either a cloud or a light that appears occasionally, will-o'-the-wisps, or ignis fatui, or such like, or a fragrant vapor that sometimes, nobody knows how, affects men's senses and causes them to feel dull, sad and depressed. Now, this breath of nature, with its constant pulsations, with its ceaseless permutations of expansion and contraction, shows itself in the varied conditions of the atmosphere in a sixfold form, being the originating cause of cold, heat, dryness, moisture, wind and fire. These are sometimes called the 6 breaths of nature. These 6 breaths then produce, under the combined influence of the 5 planets and the 5 elements, the 24 seasons, which are therefore generally called the 24 breaths of nature. The breath of nature allied to the element wood, and guided by Jupiter, produces rain, combined with the element metal and ruled by Venus, the breath of nature produces fine weather. Joining the element fire and influenced by Mars, the breath of nature produces heat, supported by the element water and ruled by Mercury, the breath of nature produces cold. And with the help of the element earth and influenced by Saturn, it causes wind. This is the whole system of Chinese meteorology. But the question now arises, how can we, quite apart from the general working of nature's breath, determine, with reference to any given locality, whether there is a favorable or unfavorable breath there, or any breath at all? Here, again, the Feng Shui system makes use of the allegory of the azure dragon and the white tiger. We have remarked above that the surface of the earth is but the dim mirror of the configurations, powers and influences of the heavens, that therefore every constellation of heaven has its counterpart on earth. We have also noticed that one of the 4 quadrants of the starry heavens, the one in the east or to the left of the looker-on, is ruled by a spirit called the azure dragon, embodying as it were the combined influences of 7 constellations. The western or right-hand quadrant, comprising also 7 constellations, is represented by a spirit called the white tiger. The azure dragon and the white tiger are therefore but emblems indicating the subtle influences, the vital breath of the eastern, male, and western, female, divisions of the firmament. Wherever there is nature's breath pulsating, there will be visible on earth some elevation of the ground. Where nature's breath is running through the crust of the earth, the veins and arteries, so to speak, will be traceable. But nature's breath contains a twofold element, a male and female, positive and negative, expanding and reverting breath, resembling, as we in modern English would put it, 2 magnetic currents or, as the Chinese put it, the azure dragon and the white tiger. Where there is a true dragon, there will be also a tiger, and the 2 will be traceable in the outlines of mountains or hills running in a tortuous and curved course. Moreover, there will be discernible the dragon's trunk and limbs, nay, even the very veins and arteries of his body, running off from the dragon's heart in the form of ridges or chains of hills. As a rule, therefore, there will be an accumulation of vital breath near the dragon's waist, whilst near the extremities of his body the energy of nature's breath is likely to be exhausted. At a distance of 20 li, or 6 miles, it is said the breath becomes feeble and ineffective. But even near the dragon's heart, the breath of nature, unless well kept together by surrounding hills and mountains, will be scattered. Where the frontage of any given spot, though enjoying an abundance of vital breath, is broad and open on all sides, admitting the wind from all the 4 quarters, there the breath will be of no advantage. For the wind scatters it before it can do any good. Again, suppose there is a piece of ground with plenty of vital breath, and flanked by hills, which tend to retain the breath, yet the watercourses near the place run off in straight and rapid course. There also the breath is scattered and wasted before it can serve any beneficial purposes. Only in places where the breath of nature is well kept together, being shut in to the right and left and having a drainage carrying off the water in a winding tortuous course. There are the best indications of a permanent supply of vital breath being found there. Building a tomb or a house in such a place will ensure prosperity, wealth and honor. As a general rule, it is observed, that whenever one meets with doubtful ground which shows no clear indications of the dragon's veins, it is best to look for the most secluded retired corner. For in retirement it is that tiger and dragon are most closely intertwined, and there the breath is gathered most abundantly. And suppose ground has been found where both dragon and tiger are completely delineated, the rule is then to look near the junction of dragon and tiger for some little hollow or little mound. Or in short some sudden transition from male to female or from female to male ground. For the body of the dragon and the surrounding hills should always exhibit both male and female characteristics up to the very point where the luck-bringing site is to be chosen. I have hitherto only spoken of the natural and beneficial breath of nature. But there is also a poisonous, deadly exhalation of nature's breath. And it is one of the supposed advantages of the Feng Shui system that it points out and warns people against a place where the erection of a tomb or house would entail loss of life and calamities over coming generations. Very frequently, it is said, there are places showing all the outward appearances of good dragon ground, and betraying no visible sign of the existence of malign influences. And yet the ground would bring untold calamities and utter desolation on any family that would venture to choose a site there for a tomb or a dwelling place. In such cases it is only the compass that will indicate the presence of a noxious breath, by marking the disharmony of the planetary influences and the discord of the elements. But in general the existence of a pernicious breath will betray itself by outward indications. Wherever there is a hill or mountain, abruptly rising up from the ground, and running up in bold straight lines, or shows an exceedingly rugged rough appearance, without any gradual slopings, there is dangerous breath there. Generally speaking, all straight lines are evil indications, but most especially when a straight line points towards the spot where a site has been chosen. Even suppose you have found a place where both the dragon to the left and the tiger to the right are curved each like a bow, but from the side of each, ridges are running down in straight lines, resembling each an arrow laid on a bow. That would be an absolutely dangerous configuration. Or, suppose you have found a place abounding in good auspices, but some distance opposite you there is a straight running ridge or watershed, or say a railway embankment, by no means pointing in the direction of your site, but running across your frontage in a straight line, there would be caused by this line a deadly breath, ruining all your fortunes and those or your descendants. As straight lines of ridges or chains of hills are supposed to produce malign influences, thus it is also with creeks, canals or rivers, that run off in straight lines. Water is in the Feng Shui system always looked upon as the emblem of wealth and affluence. Where the water runs off in a straight course, it will cause the property of people dwelling there to run off and dissipate like water. Tortuous, crooked lines are the indications of a beneficial breath, and will serve to retain the vital breath where it exists. Another indication of the existence of a malign breath are detached rocks and boulders, unless they are screened and covered by trees and bushes. There are many instances given in geomantic books of tombs situated near rocks and loose boulders, but the latter being screened by dense vegetation and shaded by high trees. The tomb in question exercised for generations the most beneficial influence, heaping rank, honor, wealth, longevity, progeny and so forth upon the families whose ancestors were buried there. But by and by, unbelief in Feng Shui, or avidity, or the hatred of a malicious enemy caused the trees to be felled and the shrubs which screened the boulders to be cut down. Whereupon immediately sudden disgrace and misfortunes came upon those families. They were deprived of their rank, of their emoluments, their wealth scattered, and their descendants had to go out upon the highways of life to beg and starve. Hong Kong, with its abundance of rocks and boulders scattered about on the hillside, abounds accordingly in malign breath. And the Chinese think our government very wise in endeavoring to plant trees everywhere on the hill to screen these harbingers of evil. But the most malicious influence under which Hong Kong suffers is caused by that curious rock on the edge of the hill near Wan Chai. It is distinctly seen from Queen's Road East, and foreigners generally see in it Cain and Abel, Cain slaying his brother. The Chinese take the rock to represent a female figure which they call the bad woman, and they firmly and seriously believe that all the immorality of Hong Kong, all the recklessness and vice of Taipingtian are caused by that wicked rock. So firm is this belief impressed upon the lowest classes of Hong Kong that those who profit from immoral practices actually go and worship that rock, spreading out offerings and burning frankincense at its foot. None dares to injure it, and I have been told by many otherwise sensible people that several stonecutters who attempted to quarry at the base of that rock died a sudden death immediately after the attempt. Now, all these evil influences, whether they be caused by straight lines of hills or watercourses or by rocks and boulders, can be fended off or counteracted. The best means to keep off and absorb such noxious exhalations is to plant trees at the back of your abode and keep a tank or pond with a constant supply of fresh water in front of your house. This is the reason why in South China every village, every hamlet, every isolated house has a little grove of bamboos or trees behind and a pond in front. A pagoda, however, or a wooded hill, answers the same purpose, and for this reason the heights of Canton, with their 5-storied pagoda, are supposed to fend off the evil breath of nature and to protect the whole city. Another device to keep off malign influences is to place opposite your house gate a shield or octagonal board with the emblems of the male and female principles, or the 8 diagrams painted thereon. And to give the pathway leading up to your front door a curved or tortuous direction. Lions carved in stone or dragons of burnt clay also answer the same purpose, and may be placed either in front of a building or on the top of the roof. But by far the best and effective means is to engage a geomancer, to do what he says, and to pay him well. V. The forms and outlines of nature. We now come to the last division of the system of Feng Shui, the doctrine of nature's outlines and forms of appearance. This section, however, forms merely a practical application of the general rules and ideas laid down in the preceding chapters, and I need not therefore enter upon details at great length. I have already spoken of those elevations of the ground which indicate the presence of nature's breath, with its 2 currents of male and female, positive and negative energy, symbolically called dragon and tiger. The relative position and configuration of these two, the dragon and tiger, as indicated by hills or mountains, is the most important point, as regards the outlines and forms of the earth's surface. I will not enter into an enumeration of all those configurations which make the relative position, extent and direction of these two symbolic elements favorable or unfavorable. Suffice it to say that they are most happily placed when they form a complete horseshoe. That is to say, where 2 ridges of hills starting from one point run out to the right and left in a graceful curve, their extremities gently turning inwards towards each other. Such a formation of hills or mountains is the sure index of the presence of a true dragon, and if other conjunctions counteract it not, the influence of a locality, chosen at the point where dragon and tiger start to the right and left, will be all that can be desired. Another important element in the doctrine of the outward forms of nature is the direction of the watercourses. We have had occasion to allude to this more than once, and the chief point is, that water running off in straight lines or forming in its course sharp angles is absolutely dangerous. A curved and tortuous course is the best augury of the existence of beneficial influences. But the junction of 2 watercourses is likewise an element that should not be overlooked. The junction should take place in a graceful curve, and the conjoined waters roll on in tortuous course, crossing and recrossing the plane. A third subject that calls for attention here is the form and shape of the hills, especially the outlines of their summit. I have remarked above that the summits of hills and mountains are the embodiment of certain heavenly bodies. It is therefore one of the first requirements of a geomancer that he should be able to tell at a moment's glance which star is represented by any given mountain. As to the planets and their counterparts on Earth, the rules by which each mountain may be referred to the one or other of the 5 planets are very simple. If a peak rises up bold and straight, running out into a sharp point, it is identified with Mars and declared to represent the element fire. If the point of a similarly shaped mountain is broken off and flat but comparatively narrow, it is said to be the embodiment of Jupiter and to represent the element wood. If the top of a mountain forms an extensive plateau, it is the representative of Saturn, and the element Earth dwells there. If a mountain runs up high but its peak is softly rounded, it is called Venus and represents the element metal. A mountain whose top has the shape of a cupola is looked upon as the representative of Mercury, and the element water rules there. Now of course, where there are several mountains or hills in close proximity, it is all important to find out whether the planets and the elements, which these mountains individually represent, form a harmonious peaceful union. For the luck of a place depends in a great measure upon this, that the planets and elements influencing it should be friendly or allied to each other, either producing each other or indifferent to each other. Suppose there is close to a hill resembling Jupiter and therefore representing the element wood, another with the outlines of Mars and corresponding to the element fire, it is manifest that this is a most dangerous conjunction. For instance, the peak of Hong Kong, presenting the outlines of Jupiter, is under the influence of wood. Now, at the foot of the peak there is the hill called Taipingtian, with the outlines of Mars, and therefore the representative of fire. Now, a pile of wood with fire at the bottom, what is the consequence? Why, it is no wonder that most fires in Hong Kong occur in the Taipingtian district. We see, therefore, it is most important to consider not only to which planet each hill or mountain belongs, but also the mutual relation, friendly or destructive, of the several planets and elements represented by the different peaks. More obscure is the method by which the presence of the so-called 9 stars of the northern bushel is detected. These 9 stars, with their fanciful names and dreadful influences, have no fixed outlines to indicate their characteristics and facilitate their identification, but are to be chiefly recognized by the indication of the compass. In general, the association of ideas connected with the outlines of hills and mountains is of great importance. For instance, if a hill resembles in its general contour the form of a broad couch, then its influence will make your sons and grandsons die a premature and violent death. If you build on a mountain which resembles a boat turned bottom upwards, your daughters will always be ill, and your sons spend their days in prison. If a mountain reminds one in its general outlines of a bell, whilst at the top there are the outlines of Venus, such a mountain will cause the 7 stars of the Great Bear to throw a deadly light upon you which will render you and all the members of your family childless. Most dangerous are also hills that resemble the one or other of the following objects: a basket, a plowshare, the eye of a horse, a turtle, a terrace, a meadow. There are many more rules referring to the forms and outlines of the Earth's surface. But I think the above will suffice to give my readers a tolerably clear idea of the practical teachings of the Feng Shui system. There is only one point left to be adverted to, and this is the art of improving the natural configuration of any given place. Heaven, it is said, requires the aid of man to carry out its scheme of justice. Earth requires the aid of man to bring its products to absolute perfection. Neither heaven nor earth are complete in themselves, but leave the last finish of everything to man. Consequently, as regards the natural outlines of the earth's surface, there is much room left for the active interference of man. The influence of the planets and the 5 elements is very great, but it is not all. The influence of the natural configuration of the ground is very powerful in its influence upon the destiny of men, but man may alter the natural configurations, and improve the aspects of any unfavorable locality. If there is any elevation not high enough, he can make it higher. If any natural watershed is running in a straight line dangerous to life and property, he can either remove it or turn it into a favorable direction. If there is a mountain representing Mars and the element of fire, why he has simply to cut off the point of the mountain and thus convert Mars to Jupiter. Or, if there is a mountain disturbing the harmony of the surroundings because it bears the outlines of Jupiter, why he has merely to round off the outlines of its peak, and Jupiter is changed into Venus. This is frequently done, and especially travelers will have noticed a pointed mound here or there on the very top of a high but somewhat flat mountain. This mound is raised to convert that mountain, which being flat corresponds to Saturn, into Mars, for the element fire, though itself never giving good ground for a tomb or house, is absolutely required as an element to enter into the general configuration of the surroundings. We see, therefore, it is left in a great measure to man's foresight and energy to turn his fortunes into any channel he pleases, to modify and regulate the influences which heaven and earth bring to bear upon him. And it is the boast of the Feng Shui system that it teaches man how to rule nature and his own destiny by showing him how heaven and earth rule him. 6. The history and literature of Feng Shui. We have hitherto looked upon Feng Shui as derived chiefly from the teachings of Chu He and other philosophers of the Sung dynasty. And certainly, when we regard Feng Shui as a recognized popular system of physical science, as a methodical combination of certain philosophical ideas for definite practical purposes, we can scarcely trace its origin beyond that period so justly called the Augustan age of Chinese literature. But the most prominent ideas and practices which go to make up this system of popular superstition can be followed up to very ancient times. The leading principles of Feng Shui have their roots in remote antiquity, and it would not be exaggeration to say, that, though indeed modern Feng Shui was not a distinct branch of study or a separate profession before the Sung dynasty, AD 960-1126, yet the history of the leading ideas and practices of Feng Shui is the history of Chinese philosophy. The deepest root of the Feng Shui system grew out of that excessive and superstitious veneration of the spirits of ancestors, which, though philosophical minds like that of Confucius might construe it on an exclusively moral basis as simply an expression of filial piety, was with the mass of the Chinese people the fruitful soil from which the poisonous weed of rank superstition sprang up in profusion. Ancestral worship naturally implied the idea that the spirits of deceased ancestors could and would somehow influence the fortunes of their descendants. This superstitious notion, the existence of which can be shown in the most ancient records of Chinese thought that we possess, is the moving spring and leading instinct of the whole Feng Shui system. The next step in the direction of Feng Shui, which the superstitious mind of antiquity took, was to connect this supposed influence of deceased ancestors with the locality of their tombs and the topographical character of the surroundings of each grave. In the most primitive ages of Chinese antiquity no such custom can be shown to have been in vogue. But we have some distinct traces of the first budding of this idea. In the times of the early dawn of Chinese history, which I place not earlier than the Zhou dynasty, BC 1122, ordinary people, it is reported, used to be buried in the plain, princes on low hills, emperors under a mound on the top of high mountains. Here we have the first indication of a degree of importance being attached not only to the general situation of the tomb, but also to its construction, viz. The erection, in the case of imperial tombs, of a high mound, supposed, no doubt, to protect the back of the tomb, the dragon, in fact, of future ages. Again, it is reported, on the authority of Confucius, that in ancient times graves were so constructed that the head of the deceased should point towards the north. The words of the Liku, where the passage occurs, are, "The dead have their heads placed towards the north, the living face the south." And the Confucian commentator explains the reason of this mode of interment by saying, that the north was viewed as ruled by the female principle, the south by the male principle. That death and decomposition were considered to belong to the female or reverting breath of nature, life and vigor to the influence of the expanding or male energy. This indicates another step having been made in the direction of Feng Shui, the male and female energies of nature, and the compass distinctions of north and south, are brought to bear upon the position and construction of the tomb. The mound over the grave, which originally was the prerogative of imperial tombs, was in course of time adopted by all classes of people. In the period immediately preceding the time of Confucius it appears that it was generally considered important to have a mound of earth on every tomb. The very attitude that Confucius, the admirer of primitive antiquity, assumed with reference to this custom, which he deemed an unwarrantable innovation, shews clearly that the ancient form of interment had been deviated from and that customs and ideas were in and before his time connected with the construction of tombs which he considered himself bound to protest against. Taking all the above-mentioned indications into account, it would seem undeniable that long before Confucius the attention of mourners was directed to the importance of carefully choosing the site for a tomb and constructing the tomb itself in a certain manner prescribed by custom. It is natural to suppose that this was done with a view to guard against calamities, or to ensure prosperity which might be caused, in the opinion of superstitious worshippers of ancestral spirits, by the spirit to whom the tomb in question was dedicated. In short, the elementary principles of Feng Shui appear to have been practiced centuries before Confucius, unconsciously, as it were, by superstitious people. But there is nothing to prove that Feng Shui was reduced to a science, that it was practiced methodically as a profession. As long as the ancient belief in a supreme personal God exercised any influence on the people, the aforementioned ideas floating about among those influenced by superstition could not form themselves into a system, which required the notion of materialistic fatalism for a center round which they might gather to take the definite form and shape of a system like that of Feng Shui. Chinese devotees of Feng Shui try indeed to adduce proof that in those earliest times Feng Shui was a recognized branch of science. The passage they rely on is, however, too vague to warrant such a conclusion. Speaking of the diagrams of Fu He, the Yih-king says, "The sage looks up to heaven and, with the help of the diagrams, he observes all the celestial phenomena. He contemplates the earth and, using the same diagrams, examines the outlines of the ground." But the very sentence that follows shows that this passage does not refer to anything like Feng Shui. He traces up the origin of all things and follows again their existence to the end, thus he comprehends the theory of life and death. It is clear therefore that this passage simply refers to the use of the diagrams as applied to the universe in general. There is not the slightest evidence to show that the diagrams of Fu He or Wen Wang were ever applied, in those early times, to the geomantic position of tombs and the determination of the influence which tombs were believed to exercise upon the fortunes of men. The second period in the history of Feng Shui may be said to extend from Confucius, BC 550, to the rise of the Han dynasty, BC 202. It was in the power of Confucius and his disciples, Mencius and Sun Tzu, who exercised a strong influence on the minds of their countrymen during this period, to repress and rectify the superstitious notions already floating about among the people and tending towards a regular system of geomancy, by assuming a definite attitude, denouncing superstition and substituting an enlightened theory on the subject. But he and his disciples, though personally free from superstition, contented themselves with urging a reform of morality according to the pattern of the ancient sages, without venturing to grapple with the superstitions that were gathering round the ancient form of ancestral worship. In one word, they remained neutral, and the consequence was that superstition spread farther and farther. The position which Confucius and his disciples took with regard to those early symptoms of geomantic superstition is characteristically illustrated by an anecdote the truth of which has never been impugned. Confucius, having with some difficulty discovered the grave of his father, had it opened and the remains of his mother buried together with those of his father. On this occasion it was suggested that, in accordance with the custom of the time, a mound should be raised over the grave. Confucius, though he remarked that this was not in accordance with the rules of the ancients, did not oppose it, but it is said soon after the mound had been raised, a sudden fall of rain washed it away and leveled the ground. This little incident shows that he himself was no adherent of the geomantic superstitions of his time. But it also shows that he had not the spirit to attack and expose the absurdity and futility of a doctrine incompatible with the belief in one supreme and intelligent ruler of the universe. But he never explained clearly whether he held this belief, or whether his God was merely the physical heaven. Nor did his disciples assume a bolder attitude against superstition. They followed the example of their master and observed a studied neutrality, allowing the faith in the personal God of their revered ancient sages to be quietly supplanted by toistic speculations among the learned and polytheistic practices among the unlearned. They did not themselves believe in divination, but fully approved the application of the diagrams for purposes of divination. They did not believe in the cosmogonic speculations of their contemporaries, but they expressed no opinion on the question how the world was made. Thus they left the door open for all forms of superstition. No doubt the above-mentioned geomantic ideas spread far and wide under this studied silence of the guardians of ancient wisdom and knowledge. Though we have no data as to the extent or progress achieved by that earliest form of Feng Shui during this period. It is reported, however, that about the close of this period, BC 249, a scholar, called Shu Tsai, asserted that he had chosen his grave in a situation which would cause it at some future time to be flanked by an imperial palace. In other words, that he had found a place where he would have himself buried after his death, and that the geomantic affinities of that place were such as to cause one of his descendants to gain the throne of China. The rise of the Han Dynasty, B.C. 202, opened a new period in the history of primitive Feng Shui. When the law for the suppression of classical writings was repealed, BC 190, and every scrap that had escaped the incendiary mania of the despot of Tsin was eagerly collected, in order to republish the ancient classics, a new zest was given to Confucian studies, expounders of the classics multiplied. And Confucianism had another chance to re-establish the ancient faith. But again Confucianism was found wanting. The opening thus afforded, in the awakening of a national interest for literature, and the opportunity given to the expounders of Confucianism to set themselves and their ancient tradition right with the speculations and superstitions of their contemporaries, and to repress the absurdities of Taoist astrologers and alchemists by popular expositions of the rationale of the ancient faith and further development of it by rational study of nature. This great opening was sacrificed by Confucianists to a pedantic study of the literal meaning of their ancient texts and a dry exposition of the ancient creed. But Taoism availed of the opportunity rejected by Confucianism and raised a literature abounding in the supernatural and the marvelous which filled the minds of the people with astrological and mystic speculations and swelled the tide of superstition so that Confucianists even remain imbued with it to the present day. The very man, whose name is famous for his success in re-editing the lost Confucian classics, Lu Heng, B.C. 40, betrayed by a report he sent to the throne, as a public censor, that he believed in the geomantic superstitions, which, under the influence of Taoist astrology and cosmogony, naturally received a new impetus during this period. He reported to the emperor, that, Nefandum Faz, on the grave of a man called Wang, King, a native of Tainan in Shantung, 2 trees were so intertwined that even the leaves grew into each other. That the form of the grave resembled an erect stone or a willow whose branches grew upward. He insinuated that these were indications shewing that one of the descendants of this man would become emperor of China, a broad hint to extinguish the whole family. It was during this period that the first attempt was made to gather up the popular notions then current among the people concerning geomancy and to form them into a system. The first exponent of this system of Feng Shui is a book, published under the Han Dynasty under the title Yih-king, lit. The Canon of the Dwellings. To give the book the halo of antiquity, it was asserted that the ancient Huang Ti was its author, which assertion, though probably believed in at the time by many, was of course utterly unfounded. Even the catalogues of books published under the Han, Sui and Tang dynasties, which mention the book in question, do not mention Huang Ti as its author. This book, however, is not only a condensation of the geomantic superstitions of former ages, but it carries the doctrine of Feng Shui farther by extending the geomantic influences, which were formerly ascribed to graves only, to the dwellings of the living. The latter were called male dwellings, tombs were styled female dwellings. It also divided the diagrams, formerly only used for purposes of divination, into male and female diagrams, and applied them to determine the geomantic character of both graves and dwelling houses. Of Wenwan's 8 diagrams, those for wind, S.E. fire, S, earth, S.W., and ocean, W, were said to work in accordance with the female energy of nature, whilst the influence of heaven, N.W., water, N, mountains, N.E., and thunder, E, was declared to be in accordance with the male principle of creation. The book distinguishes 24 different means of averting calamity and ensuring prosperity by applying these diagrams according to as many different methods. And the compilers of the imperial catalogue think there is some good sense in these manipulations with the diagrams of Wenwan. The next period in the history of Feng Shui includes the time of the 3 kingdoms, AD 221 to 277, and that of the so-called Six Dynasties, AD 265 to 618. The influence which geomantic ideas obtained at the very beginning of this period is sufficiently illustrated by an incident related in the records of the first of those three kingdoms, the so-called posterior Han Dynasty, AD 221 to 263. It is reported, as a matter beyond dispute, that one Yuan Nan, desirous to find, on the occasion of his father's death, a suitable burial ground, went out to look for a place and happened to fall in with three learned men, adepts in the geomantic art, who pointed out a spot which, as they assured him, would secure for his family the highest official distinction and emoluments. He followed their advice, buried his father there, and, strange to say, soon after he was raised to a high office in the state. And his descendants continued for many generations to fill the highest and most remunerative posts in the service of the government. In that historical romance called the Memoirs of the Three Kingdoms occurs also a passage, which shows that in those early times geomancers had already learned to apply the four quadrants of the starry heavens, the azure dragon in the east, the sable warrior in the north, the white tiger in the west and the vermilion bird in the south, in order to express the varied influences which the 28 constellations were supposed to exercise on the earth. Quan Lu, it is said, approached the grave of Wu Kaiyu-qian and exclaimed, "Behold the white tiger holding a corpse in his mouth, and the vermilion bird dissolved in grief." This reference to the 28 constellations, which the Chinese, dropping the several names of the nakshatras, borrowed from Hindu astronomy, betrays already the rising influence of Buddhism. This foreign religion, officially recognized in China by one of the Han emperors, AD 62, had been propagated for several centuries in different parts of China and slowly gained a foothold. But during the reign of the above-mentioned Six Dynasties, and especially in the course of the Qin dynasty, AD 265 to 419, Buddhism became a power in the state, and gradually saturated the whole nation with its atheistic and fatalistic ideas. These doctrines naturally stimulated the progress and development of those geomantic vagaries, which had hitherto been wanting a center and a rational basis on which they might be formed into a system. Buddhism, with its atheism, fatalism and its doctrine of the ceaseless rotation of cosmic destructions and reconstructions, kalpas, supplied this want. Accordingly we find that Feng Shui received during this period, and especially under the Qin dynasty, a new impetus, new allies, new expositors. A famous but somewhat mythical personage, Kopa, is said to have collected all the ancient traditions concerning Feng Shui and published them in a book, still extant, the Sangshu, Book of Interment, which is to the present day one of the principal sources of reference for the student of Feng Shui. Many geomancers call Kopa the founder of modern Feng Shui, but they have no evidence to show in favor of this assertion beyond the simple fact, recorded in history, that Kopa was an adept in geomancy and lived under the Qin dynasty. Even the Sangshu classic itself, which treats Feng Shui with special reference to the forms and outlines of nature, cannot be satisfactorily proved to have been written by Kopa. For it is not mentioned in the catalogues of the literature produced during this period. The Sangshu is first mentioned in the catalogue of the Tang dynasty, AD 618 to 905. But even here no author is assigned to it, no mention of Kopa, to whom only the catalogue of the Sung dynasty, AD 960-1126, ascribes the authorship of this classic. Still it remains more than probable that the Feng Shui superstitions received great attention and encouragement under the reign of the Six Dynasties. It is a significant fact that all the imperial annals of these several dynasties contain, among other subjects, separate chapters on felicitous geomantic influences. And history reports as a remarkable circumstance, that when Ti, the first emperor of the Sui dynasty, AD 589, considered it worth his while to start an argument against the truth of Feng Shui. When he raised his standard, his enemies desecrated the tombs of his ancestors in order to bring upon him the calamities which Feng Shui teaches to be the natural consequence of a destroyed tomb. But notwithstanding this he succeeded in his endeavor to gain the throne, though he lost a brother on the battlefield. The words put into his mouth by the imperial historiographer of his dynasty are, if the tombs of my ancestors are not in a felicitous, geomantic, position, why did I attain to the throne? But if their position is felicitous, why was my brother killed? It was probably in consequence of this imperial dictum, that in after times the expositors of Feng Shui invented subtle theories. To explain how one and the same grave, or dwelling, might cause misfortunes to overtake one and showers of blessings to descend upon another member of the same family. With the rise of the Tang dynasty, A.D. 618 to 905, which is famous for its revival of literature generally and of poetical literature especially, which had hundreds of Buddhistic works translated from Sanskrit into Chinese, a new era opened. Particularly favorable to the propagation of mystic and fanciful doctrines assuming, as geomancy had learned to do, the garb of national as well as Taoistic and Buddhistic philosophy. The notion of 5 planets, Venus, Jupiter, Mercury, Mars, and Saturn, influencing the Earth and every living being, made its first appearance about this time, and was eagerly taken hold of by the professors of Feng Shui. The above-mentioned Book of Interment became now a popular handbook, and various other books, among which the Yih-king, the Canon on the Art of Rousing the Dragon, the Ernest, the Canon of the Green Bag, and the Yih-king, the Canon on the Doubtful Dragon, are the most important. The Yih-king mentions also, in addition to the 5 planets, the above-mentioned 9 stars, which some commentators refer to the constellation called Bushel, whilst others explain them to be the 7 stars of the Great Bear with 2 neighboring stars, others again declaring them to be floating about in space. But the Yih-king bases on the influence of these stars a whole theory of selecting propitious sites for houses or tombs. The Ernest opens with an exposition of the mystic properties of the combination of even and uneven numbers, 1 to 6, 2 to 7, 3 to 8, 4 to 9, 5 to 10, and proceeds to lay down the rule that everything in heaven has its counterpart, in corresponding numbers, on earth. The Yih-king refers especially to those forms and outlines of nature where dragon and tiger do not prominently stand forth and are as it were concealed. The authorship of these 3 books is ascribed to Yang Quan-sung, who professed to be a disciple of Kopa and who developed especially that part of the Feng Shui system which refers to the signs of dragon and tiger, to the direction and shape of watersheds and the influence of watercourses. But it was not till the rise of the Sung dynasty, A.D. 960, that all the above-mentioned elements of the geomantic art gathered into one grand system, built up on a philosophical basis and developed methodically, so as to combine every form of influence which heaven may be said to exercise on earth and which both heaven and earth were supposed to have on human affairs. This system is in fact but a practical application of the materialistic speculations for which Chaolin Ke, Changming Tao, the 2 brothers Qing, and most especially the illustrious Chu He gained such general acceptation. That their cosmogonic theory of the universe, their speculations concerning the great absolute, the male and female principles and the twofold breath of nature as the prime agents of all physical phenomena, became the national faith of China. No wonder then the devotees of Feng Shui, wisely adopting all that was popular and attractive in this grand scheme of natural philosophy, and promulgating their fantastic geomantic speculations in accordance with the favorite terminology of Chu He, came in for a share in that national favor and national popularity which the great philosophers of the Sung dynasty so justly obtained. A scholar called Wang Ke was the chief representative of the Feng Shui profession at this time. He is assumed to be a disciple of Kopa, and claims the credit of having invented the theory of the mutual production and destruction of the 5 elements. It was he that systematized, in the phraseology of the new philosophy, all the traditional ideas on geomancy and reorganized the Feng Shui art on the basis of Chu He's materialism. At the present day the adherents of Feng Shui are divided into 2 classes or schools, the Tsung Miao, ancestral temple, school, which took its rise in Fokien, and the Kuang Si school. In the preceding chapters one have explained the more prominent theories which these schools have in common, and I have therefore merely to add that these 2 schools are chiefly distinguished by the comparative prominence each gives to one or other of 4 divisions of the Feng Shui system. The Fokien school of geomancers, claiming Wang Ke as their founder, attribute the greatest importance to the doctrines of the order of nature, Li, and of the numerical proportions of nature, Su. They are therefore specially attached to the use of the compass. The second school, called the Quang-Si school of geomancers, because it took its rise in the Quang-Si province, claim Yang Quansung as their founder, and lay the greatest stress on the doctrines of the breath, Ku, and outlines, Ying, of nature. They use the compass too, but only as a subordinate help in prospecting the country, for their principle is, first to look for the visible symptoms of dragon and tiger and of a good breath, and then to judge of the surrounding influences by consulting the compass. These two schools have produced a very voluminous literature, which is, however, but an expansion of the above-mentioned ideas on the basis of the philosophy of Chu He. Having thus traced the history and literature of Feng Shui down to the present, it only remains for me to add a few words as to the extent of influence which this strange medley of superstition, ignorance and philosophy possesses at the present day. 7. Conclusion. In Feng Shui we have what may be called, from a Chinese point of view, a complete amalgamation of religion and science. Unfortunately, however, the religious element in Feng Shui was through the early disappearance of the ancient theism distorted into a form of gross superstition, half Taoistic, half Buddhistic, and what I have hitherto, by a stretch of charity, called Chinese physical science is, from a scientific point of view, but a conglomeration of rough guesses at nature, sublimated by fanciful play with puerile diagrams. But however that may be, the fact remains nevertheless, that Feng Shui is at present a power in China. It is an essential part of ancestral worship which national religion, neither Taoism nor Buddhism managed to deprive of its all-pervading influence. Feng Shui is, moreover, so engrafted upon Chinese social life, it has become so firmly intertwined with every possible event of domestic life, birth, marriage, house-building, funerals, etc., that it cannot be uprooted without a complete overthrow and consequent reorganization of all social forms and habits. The pious reverence which every Chinaman accords to whatever can claim the prestige of antiquity, is another element explaining the widespread influence of Feng Shui. Its origin can indeed be traced back, as I have shown, to remote ages, but popular opinion connects the origin of Feng Shui with the ancient Huang Ti, and looks upon this system as being as ancient as China itself. Another consideration gains for Feng Shui the respect and sympathy even of many educated and learned men. This is the fundamental connection in which Feng Shui boasts to stand with the scheme of diagrams, as laid down in the Yih-king. And the fact that the whole system of Feng Shui is in perfect unity with the vagaries of Taoists and Buddhists on the one hand and Chu He's modern philosophy on the other. Feng Shui is indeed the refined quintessence of Taoistic mysticism, Buddhistic fatalism and Chu He's materialism, and as such it commands if not the distinct approval yet the secret sympathy of every Chinaman, high or low. Of course highly educated and particularly intelligent Confucianists will not acknowledge that they believe in the crude apocalyptic utterances of an ordinary geomancer. But within their own walls these same intellectual Confucianists will after all regulate every single domestic affair in strict accordance with the most approved canons of Feng Shui. Of course the Chinese government, as such, will not acknowledge the Catholicity and orthodoxy of Feng Shui, and yet it publishes year after year, with expressly imperial sanction, an almanac containing all the tables and data, references and diagrams, that a geomancer requires as a daily vademecum. Feng Shui has a legal status in China. When there is anywhere in China a dispute between people on the ground of alleged interference with and disturbance of the Feng Shui aspects of a grave or house, the judicial tribunals of China will entertain the claim, examine into its merits and decide the case on the presumption that Feng Shui is a reality and a truth, not a fiction. Feng Shui has even a political status in China. When a rebellion breaks out in any of the 18 provinces, the first step invariably taken by the government is not to raise troops, but to dispatch messengers instructed to find out the ancestral tombs of the several leaders of the rebellion, to open the tombs, scatter their contents and desecrate the graves in all possible ways. For this is supposed to be the surest means of injuring the prospects and marring the possible success of the rebels. Again, when land had to be ceded to the hated foreigner up and down the China coast, as a so-called foreign concession, the Chinese government would invariably select a spot condemned by the best experts in Feng Shui as one that combined a deadly breath with all those indications of the compass which imply dire calamities upon all that settle down there and their children's children. If the spot had not to be ceded by treaty, it would be pointed out to the unsuspecting foreigner as the only one open for sale, and anyhow the ignorant barbarian skeptic would become the supposed dupe and laughingstock of the astute Chinaman. Witness, for instance, the views held by intelligent Chinese with regard to the island of Xiamen, the foreign concession, so to say, of Canton. It was originally a mud flat in the Canton River in the very worst position Feng Shui knows of. It was conceded to the imperious demand of the foreign powers as the best available place of residence for foreigners, and when it was found that the Canton trade, once so prodigious, would not revive, would not flourish there. In spite of all the efforts of its supporters, when it was discovered that every house built on Xiamen was overrun as soon as built with white ants, boldly defying coal tar, carbolic acid and all other foreign appliances, when it was noticed that the English consul, though having a special residence built for him there, would rather live 2 miles off in the protecting shadow of a pagoda. It was a clear triumph of Feng Shui and of Chinese statesmanship. Powerful, however, as Feng Shui is, it is by no means an insuperable barrier to the introduction of foreign civilization in China. For it possesses an extraordinary amount of flexibility. It may be turned and twisted by skillful manipulation to suit almost any combination of circumstances. The most calamitous formation of country, the most portentous accumulation of deadly breath or ill-starred influences can be rectified by skill and unsparing exertion, so that all evil influences are either fended off or turned into instruments of blessing. Money, therefore, will go a long way to remove obstacles or collisions with Feng Shui. But it is a dangerous weapon, and will, if once employed, call forth an endless array of claims for money to compensate Feng Shui damages. The only powerful agent likely to overthrow the almost universal reign of Feng Shui in China I conceive to be the spread of sound views of natural science, the distribution of useful knowledge in China. There is one truth in Feng Shui, on which both this Chinese system of natural science and our Western views of physics are based. It is the recognition of the uniformity and universality of the operation of natural laws. There is one great defect in Feng Shui, which our Western physicists have happily long ago discarded. This is the neglect of an experimental but at the same time critical survey of nature in all its details. Let this defect be supplied by a full and popular exposition of the aforementioned uniformity and universality of the laws of nature. Let correct views be spread regarding those continually interchanging forces of nature, heat, electricity, magnetism, chemical affinity and motion. Let these views be set forth in as forcible and attractive but popular a form as Chu-He employed, and the issue of the whole cannot be doubtful. The fires of science will purge away the geomantic dross, but only that the truth may shine forth in its golden glory. One began with the question, what is Feng Shui? I may properly conclude by putting the same question again. What is Feng Shui? My readers will probably agree with me in the remark that Feng Shui is the foolish daughter of a wise mother. It starts with a few notions of astronomy or rather astrology, hazy and obscure, but respectable enough, considering that it was more than 2,000 years ago that the Chinese took hold of them. It is based on a materialistic scheme of philosophy, which had studied nature, in a pious and reverential yet in a very superficial and grossly superstitious manner, but which, trusting in the force of a few logical formulae in mystic diagrams, endeavored to solve all the problems of nature and to explain everything in heaven above and on the earth below with some mathematical categories. The result, of course, is a farrago of nonsense and childish absurdities. The whole system of Feng Shui may contain a bushel of wisdom, but it scarcely contains a handful of common sense. What is Feng Shui, then? It is simply the blind gropings of the Chinese mind after a system of natural science, which gropings, untutored by practical observation of nature and trusting almost exclusively in the truth of alleged ancient tradition and in the force of abstract reasoning, naturally left the Chinese mind completely in the dark. The system of Feng Shui, therefore, based as it is on human speculation and superstition and not on careful study of nature, is marked for decay and dissolution. For, as Wordsworth said, "To the solid ground of nature trusts the mind that builds for aye." The end.